Okay, I want you to just look at that Isaiah reading. You know, it's different. I can read it home. I read out loud. I listen to it on the phone, on an app, you know. I read it silently. But when we are gathered together like this, ecclesia, church, when we are gathered for this worship, it just hits differently, as my daughter would say. That hits differently. But so this is what we said. The earth, for the heavens will vanish like smoke, the earth will wear out like a garment, and those who live on it will die like gnats. Then comes the promise, but my salvation will be forever, and my deliverance will never be ended. And then what do we say? We just heard that everything's going to go up in smoke, and we're going to die like gnats. And we say, thanks be to God. Did anybody notice that? Okay, I'm just sending that out there. Well, part of what we're called to do today, I believe, in this gospel, you know, we are part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Evangelical comes from the Greek word euangelion, and it means gospel or good news. So we're called to bring the good news into the world, good news of God that we know in Jesus. So I think that my own experience with speaking the good news, I think us Lutherans are pretty good at, think of all the outreach projects you have, right? And that is one language of how we say who God is. But I'm going to say that as Lutherans in my life, in Virginia, Ohio, Michigan, I've visited other churches, other places too, that we have not been given a language. Should someone say to you, face to face, eye to eye, what is it you do on Sunday morning? We worship. Who do you worship? Triune God. What's that about? It's about Jesus. Who's Jesus? Raise your hand if any of you have ever had an encounter like that. Okay. That kind of, I'm just going to say, sets the stage for what I'm about to say. We are called and sent out to speak the good news of God's love. So we need to learn how to say this. So I wonder if any of you are so called or feel inspired. If you had that encounter, how would you answer that question? I tell you what, the kids do it up here all the time. Anybody? No. Okay, that's all right. So let me tell you about one of these encounters in my younger life. I went off to college, and my folks left and retired in the Great Smoky Mountains. I remember my dad said, I'm coming up to pick out some stuff, and I said, you're leaving? I was like, they were ready to fly, you know? So I would go down there on summertime, and visit with them, and my mom and I hiked all over the Great Smoky Mountains, national parks. I just love it down there. So on one of these trips back, it was my senior year in college, and I'm driving north on I-75 in a car, an old car. We called it the Quality Merchandise, the QM. It was an old Chevette that my Aunt Diane inherited and sold to me for $1. But it was in good working order, good enough for a senior in college, if you know what I mean. I've been driving those kinds of cars ever since. And I do not know where. It was north of Renfro Valley, which we listened to on the radio every Sunday morning throughout my childhood. But so my car stopped working. It just shut off. And by the grace of God, and I'm not lying about this, I'm panicking. I'm alone on I-75 and my car has just stopped running. So I had enough oomph left. It was like a downward, like if I'd have been going uphill in the, you know what I'm saying, returning to the flatlands of Michigan, I would have been out of luck. So I had enough like incline or decline that I could pull off the exit, and I went right into a gas station. I did not, this was in the days there were no mobile phones. So I go to the payphone and I make a collect call to my parents. Do you guys remember those days? That was crazy as I was thinking back on this. And my mom answered. And she said, "Hey, Maggie, what's up?" I said, "Oh, I'm just taking a little break here. Is Dad around? I need to ask him a couple questions about the car." She said, "Well, sure, let me get Dad." She gets Dad, and Dad says, "What's up, honey?" And I immediately start to sob like a little baby, okay? And so through my, crying fits, I was able to tell Dad, "The car is stopped, it won't start. I'm standing here in this place, and I don't know what to do." So my dad very calmly said, "Look around. Tell me what you see." I said, "There's a Sears." He said, "Good, good, good." He says, Is there a hotel or a place to stay anywhere nearby?" "Yes." He said, "Okay, the first thing I want you to do is go walk over to Sears and have them tow the car from the gas station across the street to Sears. And you're going to have them, that was when Sears doesn't exist anymore either. Is that, you know what I'm saying? Boy, the world's changing. And so, and they fixed cars back then. So I did that, walked over there, had the car towed and said, "This needs to be repaired." And then I went over to the hotel, got a room, called my parents back, collect, of course, with the same quarter I'd used at the gas station, and settled into the hotel room. And then I went back to Sears first thing in the morning and sat there. Now, I was reading a book called The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. Please raise your hand if you've ever heard of this book. Thank you. Oh, excellent. Thank you. Corrie and her family lived in the Netherlands. There were 4 kids in her family. Her dad was a watchmaker. She became a watchmaker, actually was one of the first certified watchmakers in the Netherlands. She and her family were part of the Dutch Reformed Church. And this church protested against Nazi occupation and persecution of Jews. Part of their, apparently, I read up on this, part of their theological system is that the Jews are the chosen people of God. I agree. And they're precious. So it was the whole church in that area was reaching out to save Jews. And what they ended up doing was they built a room off of Corrie's bedroom. So, and there was an alarm system that would go off. So if there were any raids or anything like that, the Jews who were in the house would sneak into this hiding place. Hence, the name of the book is The Hiding Place. Well, eventually they were found out, and Corrie's mom had already died at this point. So she and her father and her sisters, Noli and Betsy, and her brother Wilhelm, or we should say Wilhelm, were taken to a nearby prison, and they were interrogated. Her dad died 10 years later there, not 10 years, 10 days later in this particular prison. It just was too much for him. They released the rest of the family. Noli and William had moved out already. They had married and set up their own household. So it was Betsy and Corey who were at home. Eventually, they were sent to another sort of station, another work concentration camp, but eventually ended up at Ravensbrück. I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly. Ravensbrück. Betsy died while she was there. She just failed terribly in this whole process, and life in the concentration camp was too brutal for her. 10 days later, Corey was released from the concentration camp, and it's because of a clerical error. Otherwise, days after that, she would have been sent to the gas chamber. Now, I'm reading this very powerful story. I'm sitting in this tiny little room with other people who are getting their cars repaired at Sears. And I'm a young woman, alone, feeling nervous. You can understand this. And so I held my book up in front of my face. I did not make eye contact. I just read. And I hear the voice of the gentleman sitting across from me, because I've got my book in my face, like this. I hear him say, "What are you reading?" And in my head, I say, "It's on the front of the book, sir." But I say, I lower the book and I say, "It's The Hiding Place." Put it back up, I start to read again. He says, "Who's the author?" And I think, okay, maybe he can't read. I mean, you know. So I pull the book down. I say, "Corey ten Boom." He says, I start to put the book back up. He says, "What's the book about?" So I start to tell him this story, just as I'm telling you this story. And he said, "Well, what do you believe? Do you believe in this same God that this person believes in?" I said, now, at this point, I am trembling, okay? When you have one of these encounters, until you get used to it, until you learn your language, I was literally shaking. So I was called for, I'm going to say for the second time in my young life, to find words, language, to say who I believe God is. Now, we rely on the Apostles' Creed. That helps us, right? And I used that, to tell you the truth. I said, God is the creator of all that is. I'm sitting in this little room with other people who I'm assuming were as uncomfortable with this conversation as I was. But I explained that God was the creator of all that is, that I believe God created everything out of nothing, and that God is still part of creation. I said there was a historical figure, Jesus of Nazareth, who was a Jew, part of God's chosen people, and he gave us, a way of living, and I try to follow that way of living with a lot of help from a lot of people. I said, now that comes the hard part. We were still saying Holy Ghost back then instead of Spirit. So I said, there's also, God is also present to us now that Jesus has been crucified and raised. And that was like, that's where people go, huh? Okay? And I said, so God's breath, God's Spirit is with us all the time. I said, actually, I believe the Spirit is here right now. So, part of what I'm asking you to do this day is to ponder this week. Take a little time every day. Sometimes I practice proclamation of the word when I'm driving, when I'm gardening, pulling weeds. That's a great time to pray or speak out loud. People probably think I'm crazy. I don't care. Find places where you can get out of your mind and let the words come out. Does that make sense? Find words that you are comfortable with that embrace all of what we're asked to do here when Jesus says to us, "Who do you say I am?" He's saying, speak. The word in Greek is speak. And he's saying it straight to Peter. And then the passage ends with him telling all the disciples, don't tell anyone I'm Messiah yet. That story will continue next week. But what I want to do, how I want to end this proclamation is with good news. So if you look at your gospel reading, he speaks, Jesus answers Peter. This is the singular you. Blessed are you, Simon, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. So this is, you know what I'm saying? This is divine intervention. And I tell you, Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I want to talk about this, the good news of, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So Hades is the place of the dead, right? That's who it was. That's how they thought about it. And so sometimes we tend to switch the word Hades, the place of the dead, to hell. But this is not the Greek word Gehenna, it's Hades. So what thrills me every time I read this, I get goose flesh when I read this. The gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So it's not death coming after us. That's not what it's saying. It's the gospel. It is that Jesus is Messiah is coming after death. Do you see? It's God coming at death. And death will not prevail against the power of God's love. That, my friends, is good news. And that's some of the good news we are called to speak. Now, next week, you're going to hear how Jesus does this. They're not going to like the answer of those disciples, okay? It's not going to sound good to them. But for now, know this. Jesus is going after the last enemy. And the last enemy, death, will not prevail against it. Thanks be to God. Amen.